Episode 13, Trust Administration in Practice. Hello, my name is Alexander von der Fellen, and welcome to Trusts Unpacked, where we strip away myth and marketing and explain, in plain terms, how trusts actually work in real family situations. For the past 20 years, my fiduciary work has focused almost entirely on the architecture of trusts, the skill of trusteeship, and the challenge of long-term family governance. Not as a technical exercise, but as a human one. In doing so, I have advised hundreds of families, as well as institutions and advisors across the world. Alongside my advisory work, I'm a published author. I've recently completed a trilogy that reflects both the technical and the human dimensions of both the fiduciary and private banking fields. Before we begin, a brief but important note. This podcast is provided for general information and discussion only. It does not constitute legal, tax, fiduciary, or professional advice, and it should not be relied upon as such. As ever, you should always seek advice from appropriately qualified professionals in your relevant jurisdiction before making decisions or taking action. So let's start. So far in this series, we've spoken about intention, structure, roles, decision-making. Today, we turn to something far less glamorous, but no less important, and that is administration. You see, this is the part that rarely features in marketing materials. It's a part that few families ask about, and yet, when trusts unravel, administration is very often where the evidence is found. Poor administration rarely causes immediate failure. It causes delayed failure, years later, when people have moved on, when trustees have changed, when memories are unreliable, and when scrutiny finally arrives. This session is about what trust administration really involves and why it is central to trustee protection, trust resilience, and long-term credibility. So what is trust administration? Well, it's often misunderstood as clerical housekeeping, finding documents, producing accounts, sending reports, but that view trivializes the role. Trust administration is the practical expression of trusteeship. It's how decisions are captured, responsibility is evidenced, and accountability is demonstrated over time. Administration is where intention becomes traceable. A trust that is well administered tends to be trusted even by those who disagree with outcomes. A trust that is poorly administered attracts suspicion, even when decisions were made in good faith. This is not because administration guarantees good behavior. It is because it allows behavior to be understood. Administration is not separate from governance. It's governance made visible. Without administration, trusteeship becomes just a series of unprovable assertions. With it, trusteeship becomes an auditable narrative. So why is administration so often neglected? If it's so important, why is it so often weak? The answer is simple. Administration rarely feels urgent. Decisions feel urgent. Requests feel urgent. Problems feel urgent. Administration, however, feels deferrable. Minutes can be written later. Accounts can be finalized next quarter. Records can be tidied up when there is time. And there is almost never time. Trustees are often busy people. Private trustees juggle roles. Professional trustees manage volume. Administration becomes something done in gaps. The problem is that those gaps are where discipline erodes. By the time administration becomes urgent, it is usually because something has gone wrong. And at that point, administration is no longer protection. It becomes evidence. And often the wrong kind. There is another less discussed reason that administration is neglected. It's because it doesn't deliver visible success. A good investment decision produces returns. A well-timed distribution produces gratitude. A difficult refusal may preserve capital. But you see, administration produces none of those immediate rewards. It's preventative rather than productive. Trustees who administer well rarely receive praise for it. Trustees who administer badly often don't realize it until it's too late. This creates a distorted incentive. Energy flows towards action. Attention flows away from documentation. Yet from a fiduciary perspective, the most dangerous trustees are not those who make bold decisions. They are those who make reasonable decisions, but fail to evidence them. Courts don't punish ambition. They punish opacity. Administration is a discipline that turns good faith into demonstrable good conduct. Without it, trustees rely on memory and credibility, and sadly, both fade. At the heart of trust administration sit records. Trustees are expected to maintain clear, accurate, and contemporaneous records of trust assets, transactions, decisions, advice received, and distributions made. This is not about producing mountains of paper. It's about clarity. A good record allows an informed third party to understand what happened, when it happened, who was involved, and why it happened. This matters enormously. It's worth being explicit about how records are actually used in practice. When a trust is challenged, the investigation doesn't start with people, they start with files. They ask, what was recorded? When was it recorded? Was it contemporaneous? Does it reflect active consideration or passive acceptance? Gaps in records are rarely interpreted as neutrality. They are interpreted as an absence of thought. This is particularly damaging where trustees rely heavily on advisors. Advice taken but not recorded may as well not exist. Equally, advice recorded without evidence of engagement suggests delegation rather than judgment. The safest records show trustees thinking, questions asked, concerns raised, alternatives considered. They do not need to be elegant, they just need to be real. A brief note written at the time is worth far more than a polished reconstruction years later. Trusts are long-lived structures. Trustees change, advisors change, beneficiaries change. Records are the only continuity that survives all of that. A trustee who cannot explain past actions because records are incomplete is immediately exposed, regardless of how reasonable those actions may have been at the time. Good records protect trustees far more effectively than good intentions. One of the most common weaknesses is failure to record why a decision was taken. Outcomes are noted, amounts are recorded, but rationale is absent. Years later, that absence is fatal. Courts, regulators, advisors reconstruct intent from documents, not memory. Silence is rarely interpreted generously. It is worth illustrating how this plays out in practice. Some years ago, a trustee board of a trust I know approved a substantial restructuring of trust assets following some professional tax advice. The advice was reputable. The lawyers were experienced. The transaction was implemented efficiently. And for a time, nothing appeared wrong. Years later, however, a challenge arose. The tax consequences were not what had been anticipated. The restructuring had triggered a liability that no one had intended. The beneficiaries were aggrieved. Litigation followed. The central question was not whether the outcome was unfortunate, and this plainly was. The question was whether the trustees had exercised their discretion properly. In court, the trustees relied heavily on the fact that they had taken professional advice, and they had. The file contained the advisor's memorandum. It contained calculations. It contained draft documentation. What it did not contain, with sufficient clarity, was evidence of the trustees' own reasoning. The minutes of the meeting were short. They recorded that advice had been received and that the proposal was approved. They did not show what questions were asked, what risks were discussed, whether alternative options were considered, whether the trustees have actively weighed the downside. In other words, the file demonstrated delegation far more clearly than deliberation. The Supreme Court in that case, Pitt versus Holt, drew an important distinction. Trustees are not expected to be infallible. They're expected to act prudently, and prudence is judged by process, not by outcome. If trustees take appropriate advice, understand it, and reach a decision independent, they're generally protected. If they simply adopt advice without demonstrating engagement, that protection weakens considerably. The trustees in this case were ultimately relieved, but not because the court was sympathetic. They were relieved because there was just enough evidence to show that they had engaged meaningfully with the advice. Had the minutes been thinner or the documentation less contemporaneous, the result might well have been different. The lesson is uncomfortable. It's not enough to obtain good advice. Trustees must show that they thought about it. Courts don't punish trustees for being wrong. They just scrutinize whether trustees exercise judgment. That scrutiny is forensic. Judges look at timestamps. They look at drafts. They examine whether minutes were written contemporaneously or reconstructed later. They assess tone. A reconstructed minute prepared 2 years after a decision carries far less weight than a brief handwritten note made at the time. In several modern cases, trustees have attempted to tidy up records once challenge was anticipated. Courts are rarely impressed. Reconstruction reads like, well, reconstruction. It lacks the texture of real deliberation. A file that shows friction is often more protective than one that shows unanimity. A minute that records disagreement, hesitation, or requests for further clarification demonstrates active trusteeship. A minute that records only approval suggests passivity. The difference is subtle, but decisive. It is also worth noting where litigation begins. Investigations do not start with oral testimony, they start with documents, as I've said. They build a chronology from files. Only afterwards do they test recollection against that chronology. If recollection and documentation diverge, documentation always prevails. This is why contemporaneous administration matters so profoundly. It's not about volume, it's about credibility. A trustee who can produce a file showing advice received, questions asked, risks identified, alternatives considered, reasons recorded, is an entirely different position from a trustee who says, we discussed it fully at the time. The first trustee has evidence. The second has memory. Memory is fragile. Evidence endures. The deeper point is this. Administration is not defensive only when something goes wrong. It shapes behavior before anything goes wrong. Trustees who know their reasoning must be recorded, tend to reason more carefully. Trustees who know their minutes will be read by someone else tend to articulate assumptions more clearly. In this way, administration improves judgment as well as protects it. The case I've described was not about fraud. It wasn't about misconduct. It was just about process under pressure. That's where most trust disputes live. And in that environment, thin files are not neutral. They are dangerous. Now let's look at trust accounts and financial reporting. Trust accounts are frequently misunderstood. They're not simply financial statements, they are evidence of stewardship. Proper trust accounts should reflect assets, liabilities, income, expenditure, capital movements, and beneficiary distributions. They should be prepared regularly, reviewed carefully, and understood by the trustees who sign them. Signing accounts without understanding them is not a defense. Experienced trustees know this instinctively. Inexperienced trustees often underestimate it. Accounts tell a story. They show whether assets were preserved, whether distributions were consistent, whether administration was orderly, and whether trustees engaged meaningfully with the trust's finances. In disputes, accounts are often the first document examined. They reveal patterns, repeated deficits, unexplained movements, inconsistent treatments. Even where no wrongdoing exists, poor accounts invite suspicion. Good accounts do not prevent challenge, but they do make challenge harder to sustain. Trust accounts also play a crucial behavioral role internally. They force trustees to confront reality. Assets that look healthy in aggregate may reveal fragility when broken down. Distributions that feel modest may look substantial in cumulative form. cash flow pressures that felt temporary may reveal structural imbalance. Trustees who engage seriously with accounts tend to make better decisions. Trustees who treat accounts as formalities often drift into reactive management. This is particularly important where trusts are used to support lifestyles. Lifestyle support rarely feels dramatic from month to month, but over years, it reshapes the trust entirely. Accounts tell that story, whether trustees want to read it or not. Ignoring it does not prevent the outcome. It merely delays recognition. Many trustees assume that because accounts are prepared by accountants, responsibility ends there. It does not. Trustees may delegate preparation. They can't delegate responsibility. Trustees are expected to ask questions, understand the broad position, and challenge anomalies. A trustee who signs accounts they don't understand is not cautious. They are merely exposed. This is particularly important where trusts hold operating businesses, complex investment structures, or cross-border assets. Complexity increases the need for engagement, not the excuse for disengagement. Let's look at reporting to beneficiaries. Reporting is where law, expectation, and judgment intersect. Trustees have obligations to provide information, but those obligations are not unlimited. The aim of reporting is accountability, not transparency at all costs. Too little information breeds suspicion. Too much information invites misinterpretation, comparison, and challenge. And trustees must strike a careful balance. It may help to illustrate this balance through contrast. Let's consider two trusts of similar size, both discretionary, both established by first-generation entrepreneurs. The asset base is comparable. The beneficiaries are adult children in their 30s and 40s. The trustees in each case are competent and well-intentioned. The difference lies not in the structure, but in the reporting culture. The first trust, shall we call it, deals in over-disclosure. In this trust, the trustees adopt what they consider a progressive approach to transparency. Every year, beneficiaries receive detailed investment breakdowns, quarterly performance commentary, minutes summarized extensively, narrative explanations of distribution decisions, comparative performance data, forward-looking commentary on potential liquidity events. The intention is admirable. The trustees believe that more information will generate more trust. For the first few years, the atmosphere is positive. Beneficiaries feel included. Conversations are open. Questions are answered promptly. Then a pattern begins to emerge. One beneficiary notices that a particular asset class underperformed relative to a benchmark. Another questions a real estate holding that has been illiquid for several years. A third begins to compare their distributions with those of siblings in increasingly granular detail. Now, because the trustees have provided extensive detail, the beneficiaries feel entitled to interrogate it. Discussion gradually shifts from, is the trust being governed properly, to, why did you choose this allocation rather than that one? Meetings become more technical. Trustees feel compelled to justify portfolio positioning in depth. Minutes grow longer. Reporting becomes increasingly defensive in tone. Nothing improper has occurred, but something subtle has shifted. The trust is no longer perceived primarily as a government structure exercising discretion. It's perceived as a managed portfolio, open to review. Over a decade, this dynamic hardens. Beneficiaries begin to preempt decisions by circulating their own analysis before trustee meetings. They send articles, they suggest strategies, they frame requests in investment language, rather than need or purpose. The trustees wishing to maintain harmony respond at length. In doing so, they inadvertently reinforce the impression that every decision is negotiable. Structure remains legally intact, but culturally, discretion has narrowed. So let's look at the second example, which is of under-disclosure. Consider a second trust. Here, trustees take the opposite approach. Annual accounts are circulated with minimal commentary. Distributions are communicated individually without broader context. Investment performance is summarized in aggregate terms. There are no explanatory letters. Requests are responded to, but rarely contextualized. The trustees believe that excessive detail creates confusion and comparison. They aim for simplicity. For several years, this approach appears efficient. Beneficiaries receive their support. Accounts are technically compliant. No one complains openly, but uncertainty accumulates. One beneficiary wonders why distributions fluctuate year to year. Another hears informally that a property was sold but sees no clear explanation in the reporting. A third suspects that siblings are receiving different treatment. Because information is rare, inference fills the gap. Conversations occur between beneficiaries rather than with trustees. Assumptions circulate, and minor discrepancies become symbolic. After 10 years, a distribution request is declined. The refusal is legally justified and financially prudent. But the tone of the trust relationship has already shifted. The refusal is not interpreted as a discretionary judgment within a coherent framework. It's interpreted as arbitrary. The beneficiaries request more detailed information. The trustees provide it reluctantly. The sudden expansion of disclosure feels reactive rather than stable. Suspicion grows precisely because information changed under pressure. What these two examples demonstrate is that reporting is not merely informational, it's formative. Over-disclosure invites participation in decision-making. Under-disclosure invites speculation about hidden decision-making. In both cases, the trustees acted in good faith. In both cases, they misunderstood the behavioral effect of tone. Tone compounds. A detailed justificatory style of 10 to 15 years trains beneficiaries to analyze rather than to trust. A sparse, opaque style over the same period trains beneficiaries to assume rather than to understand. Neither extreme is stable. The most effective reporting frameworks sit between these poles. They're predictable, they're proportionate, they explain framework and philosophy without inviting negotiation on each decision. They communicate enough to demonstrate competence, but not so much that they transform governance into consultation. Over long time horizons, this middle ground produces something valuable, which is normalization. Beneficiaries come to see the trust not as a mystery, and not as a joint venture either, but as a structured institution operating according to known principles. That perception reduces friction. It also protects trustees. When reporting is calm and consistent, deviations are far less likely to be interpreted as manipulation. When reporting oscillates between minimal and excessive, beneficiaries infer instability. This paradox is that stability in reporting often matters more than generosity in reporting. Trustees sometimes believe that detailed disclosure demonstrates confidence. In practice, confidence is more often conveyed through restraint. A short, well-structured annual letter that recaps purpose, summarizes performance in broad terms, confirms adherence to governance process, and explains distribution philosophy may generate far more long-term stability than a 50-page investment pack. Over a decade, beneficiaries rarely remember specific numbers. They do remember how the trust made them feel. Predictable reporting reduces anxiety. Reactive reporting amplifies it. There's also a subtle issue of narrative authority. When trustees over-explain, they implicitly concede that decisions require persuasion. When trustees under-explain, they risk appearing dismissive. The aim is neither persuasion nor dismissal. It's legitimacy. Legitimacy arises when beneficiaries believe decisions are being made thoughtfully, process is consistent, information is proportionate, and the structure is stable. In practice, this often means that reporting should change very little from year to year. The same format, the same level of detail, the same tone. Minor adjustments may be necessary as the trust evolves, but dramatic shifts in reporting style are rarely neutral. Beneficiaries notice them immediately. Over 10 or 15 years, this quiet consistency becomes cultural. The trust becomes part of the family's background architecture rather than its foreground tension. And that is the point. Reporting is not an annual event. It's a long-term behavioral signal. Trustees who understand this tend to administer more calmly. Beneficiaries who experience it tend to challenge less frequently. Not because they are less curious, but because uncertainty has been managed before it could become suspicious. Clear, consistent reporting helps manage expectations. Inconsistent, reactive, or overly detailed reporting does the opposite. There is also a strategic dimension to reporting that is often overlooked. Reporting sets tone. A report that is calm, measured, and consistent communicates stability. A report that is defensive, verbose, or reactive communicates fragility. Beneficiaries read between the lines, after all. They notice changes in language, sudden increases in detail, shifts in emphasis. Trustees who begin to over-explain often do so because they feel exposed. Ironically, this exposure is often self-inflicted. The strongest reporting frameworks are boring. They change little year to year. They avoid narrative drama. They normalize governance. Boredom is underrated in trust administration. It signals order. Reporting should explain, the framework, the governance process, and the overall health of the trust. It should not justify every decision, disclose internal deliberations, or invite negotiation. Once trustees begin reporting defensively, authority erodes. Beneficiaries don't need to agree with decisions. They just need confidence that decisions are being made properly. Reporting isn't just legal compliance, it's also behavioral management. The way information is framed shapes how it is received. Regular, calm reporting normalizes trust governance. Irregular or crisis-driven reporting amplifies anxiety. Trustees who report only when pressed often find that pressure increases. Those who report predictably tend to reduce it. This isn't because beneficiaries are satisfied. It's because uncertainty is reduced. Good trusts are governed, not drifted. This usually involves regular trustee meetings, agendas that reflect real decisions, proper minutes, and periodic review of strategy and risk. Meetings don't need to be frequent, but they must be purposeful. A meeting without decisions is often a warning sign. Minutes matter enormously. They do not need to record everything said, but they must record what decisions were made, what was considered, and why conclusions were reached. In so many disputes I've seen, minutes become the most important document in the room. They either demonstrate thoughtful engagement or expose its absence. Silence in minutes is dangerous. Explicit acknowledgement is protective. Meetings deserve particular attention. Many trusts hold meetings out of habit rather than purpose. Papers are circulated, updates are noted, and nothing is decided. That's not governance, it's theatre. Effective trustee meetings have friction, not conflicts, but friction. Different perspective, testing of assumptions, challenge of proposals. Minutes that reflect friction demonstrate judgment. Minutes that record only consensus invite scrutiny. Courts are not alarmed by disagreement. They are alarmed by passivity. A trustee who never dissents is not necessarily aligned. They may just be disengaged. Good chairs understand this. They draw out views. They insist on articulation of reasoning. And they resist premature closure. This discipline shows up clearly in minutes. And it protects everyone involved. What about long-term governance? Because long-term governance is not static. Trusts evolve, assets change, beneficiaries mature, risk profiles shift. Trustees who never review governance are not stable, they are stagnant. Periodic review of investment approach, distribution philosophy, reporting practices, and risk exposure is a sign of stewardship, not instability. Good administration allows governance to adapt without becoming chaotic. Governance failure often looks like continuity, the same approach, the same decisions, the same assumptions. But over time, this becomes rigidity. Trusts that are not periodically re-examined often drift out of alignment with reality. Assets change character, beneficiaries change maturity, risk tolerance shifts. Let me illustrate what this kind of long-term diligence really looks like in practice, because it's rarely dramatic. And again, this is from my book, Trust. I was once asked to advise a remarkable Japanese entrepreneur who had sold a successful technology business after decades of disciplined work. He wasn't interested in wealth optimization or legacy in the Western sense. His concern was simpler and yet harder: how to provide for his children without disrupting their lives, and how to do so without noise, complexity, or future friction. Nothing about the case was urgent, and again, that was the danger. His family lived across Japan and the United States. Different tax systems, different cultures, different expectations. On the surface, it looked like a straightforward international trust arrangement. In reality, it required sustained diligence to prevent slow failure. From the outset, the work was unglamorous: long conversations, careful listening, understanding not just assets, but temperament. He valued restraint, predictability, and privacy. Any structure that created reporting surprises, administrative drama, or cultural discomfort would fail, regardless of how elegant it looked. The trust we designed was deliberately modest in appearance: Singapore law, conservative distributions, clear reporting lines, nothing clever. What mattered was not novelty, but fit. The diligence came afterwards. Calendars were maintained years ahead. Valuations were refreshed even when markets were quiet. Accounts were prepared promptly even when no one was asking. Distribution decisions were documented even when they were routine. Legal advice was refreshed when beneficiaries' circumstances changed, not when a problem arose. At one point, a small but important issue emerged. A change in U.S. tax interpretation meant that a future distribution to one beneficiary could have triggered an unexpected reporting burden. It would not have caused a crisis, but it would have caused irritation, confusion, and distrust. Because the trust had been reviewed carefully, and because administration had not drifted, the issue was caught early. The structure was adjusted quietly. No beneficiary ever knew that there had been a problem. That is diligence. Nothing happened. No arguments, no complaints, no lawyers. And that was precisely why it was so successful. Years later, when the settlor's health declined, the trust operated exactly as intended. Support flowed predictably. Reporting continued uninterrupted. There was no scramble for information, no uncertainty about records, and no retrospective reconstruction of decisions. After his death, the transition was almost imperceptible. The trust did not become a focal point of emotional suspicion. It simply continued. What this case reinforced for me is that diligence is not about activity. It's about accuracy, about showing up consistently when nothing appears to demand attention, about caring for the structure when it is quiet and not when it is under attack. Most trust failures do not begin with bad intentions. They begin with deferred reviews, skimmed papers, and the assumption that someone else is paying attention. Diligence prevents that drift. It's not exciting. It doesn't announce itself, but what it allows is trustees to stand calmly when scrutiny arrives and to say, with evidence rather than confidence, that the trust has been run properly. This is why administration matters, not because regulators demand it, but because trusteeship without diligence is not trusteeship. It's hope. And this brings us to the central point. Administration is not bureaucratic burden, it's protection. When trustees are challenged, they do not defend themselves with explanations. They defend themselves with evidence. Let's reflect on what's been happening in Cayman and the BVI over the past decade. Offshore litigation has matured. Trust disputes no longer revolve primarily around dramatic allegations of fraud or dishonesty. Increasingly, they concern process. And when these disputes reach court, the first battlefield is not intention, it is documentation. Minutes, valuation records, conflict disclosures, evidence of deliberation. Trusts are often challenged many years after the original decisions were taken. By then, trustees may have changed, advisors may have retired. Memories are imperfect. What remains are files. Courts in Cayman and the BVI have repeatedly scrutinized whether trustees can demonstrate that they actively exercise discretion. Not whether the outcome was commercially successful, not whether beneficiaries were content at the time, but whether there is a contemporaneous record showing that trustees thought. In several cases, trustees were not accused of dishonesty. They were criticized for something more subtle and more common: insufficient recording of reasoning. reliance on informal conversations that were never minuted, failure to document how conflicts were identified and managed. And in some instances, trustees had taken advice, but there was little evidence of engagement with it. In others, asset valuation had been obtained, but the basis on which these valuations were accepted or challenged was unclear. In still others, personal conflicts were discussed informally, but never formally disclosed or recorded. When these cases reached court, the question was not, what do you remember? It was, where is the paper trail? That shift matters. Judges increasingly reconstruct events from documents rather than testimony. A thin file invites skepticism. A detailed but mechanical file invites questions about independence. A file that shows active consideration recorded contemporaneously, however, that carries weight. That's precisely why administration must be understood as protection. Offshore courts are not hostile to trustees, but they do expect discipline. Where trustees can produce clear minutes, valuation records, and documented conflict management, they're in a fundamentally stronger position. Where they cannot, even honest trustees find themselves vulnerable. In this environment, memory is anecdote, documentation is defense. And that is not a technical nuance. It's the difference between standing calmly in litigation and scrambling to reconstruct the past. Well-kept records, clear accounts, consistent reporting, proper governance. Those are the things that allow trustees to show that decisions were made properly, even if outcomes were unprepared. Poor administration removes that protection entirely. Trustees then find themselves defending intent rather than process, and that is a far weaker position. So what have we learned in this, our 13th episode? First, that administration is not clerical support. It is governance made visible. Second, that poor administration rarely causes immediate failure. It causes delayed vulnerability. Third, that records are not written for convenience. They're written for the future, for successor trustees, for advisors, for courts. Fourth, that accounts are not accounting formalities. They are behavioral mirrors. They reveal drift, concentration, imbalance, and cumulative effect long before trustees feel it intuitively. Fifth, that delegation does not remove responsibility. Trustees may outsource preparation. They cannot outsource understanding. Sixth, that reporting is not about satisfying curiosity. It's about maintaining legitimacy. Too little information breeds suspicion. Too much creates noise. Seventh, that meetings and minutes are not theatre. They're the written proof that trustees engaged, tested assumptions, and exercised judgment. Eighth, that governance must be reviewed deliberately. Trusts that never re-examine their own structure are not stable. Ninth, that diligence is preventative, not reactive. The strongest trusts are often the quietest because the work was done before the pressure appeared. And finally, that administration is not bureaucracy. It is protection. When trustees are challenged, they don't defend themselves with memory or confidence. They defend themselves with process, records, and evidence. In short, administration is a discipline that allows trusteeship to endure. It does not generate applause. It generates resilience, and that is why it matters. That was Trust Administration Unpacked. Join me in the next episode, number 14 of our series, where we unpack trusts and family governance and how family conflict can be prevented before it even starts. Until then, I am Alexander von der Fallen.